Hi, everybody. Welcome to Module 3. Today I have joining me Deirdre Pike. Deirdre is our Employee and Labor Relations Manager with the Upper Grand District School Board, and she's going to share a slideshow with you and talk to you about some of the implications for you as leaders, as principals in your building, and considerations for you around employee and labor relations. So I'm just going to pull up her slideshow now, and then she will share with you. So just one moment. Here we go. Welcome, Dee.
Thank you very much, Carrie. I'm happy to be here in these unorthodox times as we transition to some distance learning for our future leaders. So we'll spend a few minutes today going through a whirlwind tour of labor relations and the principal performance appraisal. So we'll spend some time on collective agreements and negotiations, understanding how we evolved from primarily local bargaining into this new two-tier bargaining that we now find ourselves in. We'll also spend some time speaking about grievances and arbitrations and how a grievance evolves to an arbitration. And then we'll spend some time on the principal performance appraisal. So collective agreements and negotiations. So in a general sense, a CBA is a collective bargaining agreement, which is an agreement between the employer, being the school boards, the union, and the employees that are represented by the collective agreement. A collective agreement enables the parties to do certain things and also ensures that the parties refrain from doing other things. Most importantly to know, though, is that a collective bargaining agreement is binding on all three parties. Essentially, a collective agreement is broken into two broad subject areas. There is the economic and the non-economic. As local bargaining and central bargaining has evolved, the CBA has really focused primarily on the central part A of all of the collective agreements, focusing primarily on the economic subjects that affect the employees, and a lot of the non-economic are bargained at the local level. In addition to specific language within the collective agreement, there may also be letters of agreement, often referred to LOAs, and they may be appended or not appended to the collective agreement. What that means is a letter of agreement may actually reside in the collective agreement and be appended, or it may live outside of the collective agreement. When we refer to central bargaining, we are talking about the provincial government, the provincial bargaining unit, and the board representatives, which are either OPSBA, the Ontario Public School Board Association, or the CTA, the Council of Trustee Associations. Local bargaining involves the local school board, the local bargaining unit, and the employees that are represented locally at that board. A collective bargaining agreement has 4 mandatory provisions, and they are set out in the Ontario Labour Relations Board as the recognition clause. That clause identifies who is represented by the collective agreement, but also who is not represented by the collective agreement. There are provisions for final binding of settlement of disputes. There is a no strike, no lockout clause. Important to know, as we've evolved to a two-tier bargaining model, school boards may find themselves in either provincial sanctions and or local sanctions with their local unions. The term of agreement is always identified within the collective bargaining agreement, and that can vary from a minimum of 1 year to 3 and 4 year collective agreements, which have been traditional over the last decade within the education sector. What's important to note is that all collective bargaining agreements must be in writing. 2 items that you will always find within a collective agreement are both the management rights and union representation. Management rights are always located as one of the earliest articles of the collective bargaining agreement. For the employer, it is one of the most critical articles of the collective agreement. What's important to know is that it should not be applied arbitrarily. Often, you may hear someone speak in your local school board that says, we have a right. We're the employer. We have a right. And while the employer does have a right, all of our actions need to be done in good faith, and they need to be done for just cause and based on the most benefit to both the employer and to the employees. It's not appropriate to act in bad faith and make a decision simply because it's our management right to do so. Where the collective agreement is silent on a matter, the employer has the right to make that unilateral decision affecting the employees. But again, those decisions must be made in good faith, and we do not apply them arbitrarily. Union representation. Within this clause, it will identify the persons who have the responsibility for the administration of the collective bargaining agreement on behalf of the union. It's important to note that unionized employees must also be adequately represented with respect to any interviews, grievances, corrective actions, or any other type of disciplinary proceeding. As future leaders, we must represent that the union is obliged under the Labor Relations Act for what's called a DFR, a duty of fair representation. This is an obligation that is placed on a union to ensure that it represents their members appropriately and in good faith to the extent of the collective agreement. It also ensures that prior to 2008, all collective bargaining occurred at the local level, involving the local school board and the appropriate local bargaining unit. In 2008-2012 collective agreements, while they were negotiated locally, discussions began at the provincial table, primarily related to items of a monetary value. This began what's referred to as the PDT, the Provincial Discussion Table. In 2012, the collective agreement expired. During that round of bargaining, there were challenges between the provincial government from a funding perspective and school boards and unions. The provincial government at the time identified that they would be imposing collective agreements on all of the parties. That resulted in the establishment of memorandums of understanding, which applied for the 2012 through to 2014 years. The MOUs, as they became known, identified the separation between the central and local items. The central being the items of a primarily monetary value. Sick leave became a central item. So all members represented, for example, by the Elementary Teacher Federation of Ontario were subject to the same sick leave language, whether they worked at the Upper Grand District School Board or they worked at the Simcoe Public School Board. Sick leave, wages, benefits, etc., all became an item that was centrally applied to all the members represented by that agreement. Items of primarily a non-monetary value remain negotiated at the local level. The bargaining units initiated what was referred to as a charter challenge, identifying that the rights of the bargaining unit and their affected members had been violated and their right to bargain had been eliminated by the provincial government. In April 2016, a decision of the arbitrator confirmed that, in fact, a charter violation had occurred, and the provincial government began discussions with all of the affected unions to correct the errors of the 2012-14 memorandums of understanding. And that is referred to as the remedy agreements, in which each of the provincial unions who filed a charter challenge negotiated terms to remedy the removal of their right to bargain. In 2014, the School Board Collective Bargaining Act, known as the SBCBA, was established. This is an extremely important piece of legislation as it essentially governs the collective bargaining process within the education sector. It identifies the roles of the bargaining parties, being the school board bargaining agents, such as OPSBA, Ontario Public School Board Association, or the CTA, the Council of Trustee Association, the union, and the Crown. Within this SBCBA, the process of both the central and local bargaining and the scope of the matters which will be discussed at the central table are defined. The role of the Crown at the central bargaining table is identified within the SBCBA, as are the requirements for the notice to bargain and the obligation for the parties to meet within 15 days once the notice to bargain has been filed. It's important to know that once a bargaining unit has initiated or provided notice to bargain and/or the school board, that notice to bargain applies to both the central and the local bargaining discussions. In 2014-2017, this was essentially the first locally and centrally bargained collective agreement which identified Part A, the central agreements which apply to all boards in Ontario, and Part B, the local terms which apply to that particular school board. It's very important to know that Part B local terms may also apply to the central terms where the local terms provide superior language, such as a local school board may have provided for supplemental employment benefit top-up for maternity leave for up to 12 weeks, where the central agreement provides the said benefits for 8 weeks. In those circumstances, Part B of the local collective agreement would actually be imposed as opposed to Part A because it provided superior language for those local members. It would only apply to that particular school board. And the Part A central language regarding maternity sub would apply to all other school boards in which there were no superior local language. In August 31st, 2017, the collective agreement expired. What ought to have been the commencement of the next round of local and central bargaining resulted in what has been referred to as collective agreement extensions. During this process, there was no local bargaining. The terms of the Part A and the Part B of the collective agreement essentially extended to August 31st, 2019, with some agreed upon items, again, of a monetary primary value, with the provincial bargaining units, the school board association, and the Crown. So where do we find ourselves today? August 31st, 2019, all of our collective agreements expired. Early notice to bargain was filed in April of 2019, which enabled the parties to begin bargaining. That bargaining took place primarily in the central Part A process. Over this last year, all central agreements have been negotiated, they have been voted on, and they have been ratified. So whether that be OECTA, OSSTF, CUPE, ETFO, Unifor, etc., all central agreements as of today's date have been negotiated and ratified. School boards now find themselves negotiating their local terms within all of their different collective agreements, all school boards being in different positions. Some have negotiated the local terms and voted and ratified, whereas others are still in the negotiation process. The term of the agreement, again, within the SBCBA, it establishes that the term of agreement is set by the central parties, and this collective agreement commences September 1st, 2019 to August 31st, 2022. While collective bargaining is stressful on all parties, especially our current leaders and our future leaders, what's critical to remember is that during bargaining, the focus is on the day after. A lot of emotions fly, a lot of personal feelings, a lot of personal stressors exist during collective bargaining, especially as a leader where you find yourselves perhaps finding your way through local sanctions or central sanctions and still trying to support the people that are in your school and also respect the bargaining process. A lot of emotions will be rolling around from your employees, from yourself, from your school board, from the unions. And it's really, really critical that you don't let yourself be caught up in those emotions, that you maintain that good faith, that impartiality and respect for your colleagues and for the people that work in your school, because the focus needs to be on the day after. Once the collective agreement is signed and it's ratified, all of those stressors are forgotten, but what's remembered by your staff is how you behaved during that process. So the focus must be on the day after and the preservation of relationships, both with the staff that report to you and also with your local union leaders. Grievances and arbitration. If you recall earlier, I indicated that there were 4 statutory requirements of a collective bargaining agreement. The grievance arbitration process is the second statutory requirement. Essentially, it's a mechanism to reach effective resolution of disputes between the parties being the school board and the local union. A grievance in our current circumstance, it's important to understand that a grievance could be filed either locally or the grievance could be of a central matter, depending on where the violation occurred. If it occurred as a result of language within the local section of the collective agreement and or the central component of the collective agreement. There are 3 types of grievances. There is an individual grievance. For example, a grievance may be filed whereby a teacher is not provided the appropriate planning time for the week and they are owed planning minutes. There may be a group grievance where the grievance is affecting more than one employee, or there could be a management policy grievance. Within the grievance arbitration process, it moves from an informal stage, which is the process whereby the issue is initially, it arises and it's reported, and efforts are exhausted at that point to settle the dispute, all the way to the filing of a step 1, which is the first formal process in the grievance, to a step 2 and or potentially step 3 and 4, which may be mediation, and arbitration being the final level of the grievance arbitration procedure. Essentially, within grievance management process, the issue arises and the union, often known as the steward, will approach you as the principal, vice principal at the school to discuss the issue, or the staff member may come alone to see you. For example, Again, if we focus on a teacher, they may review the schedule and realize that they have been assigned an extra 4 minutes of supervision duty per week. As the leader of the school, it's your responsibility to look at the schedule, assess it, and if in fact they have been assigned more minutes than they ought to be assigned, then you correct that. That's the informal stage. So the issue was raised, you assessed it, and you corrected it, and it was all done within the informal stage. Other times, the issue may be raised. As the leader, you may not agree with the position of the staff member and or the steward. It's important that you listen, that you document, that you reach out to your colleagues and the board directly, the Labor Relations Department and or your superintendent of education, to obtain appropriate advice. Just because the union raises the issue to you, you are not required to give an immediate response. It's very important that you take the time and that you look into the matter and you do the appropriate research. If the issue is not resolved at the informal stage, it becomes a formal grievance, and it moves through the various steps that we chatted about, from a step 1 all the way to arbitration. And the particular steps within the grievance procedure will be identified in the relevant collective agreement. And every collective agreement will have a grievance article, and it will identify the steps and at what stage a grievance is initiated, depending on the significance of the grievance. Once a formal grievance is filed, the union will send that grievance to the Human Resource Department. Human Resources will likely contact you for background information, trying to ascertain the issue, the position of the administrator or vice principal, how it affects other staff, how it affects students, and your rationale up to that point. It's very important that you keep detailed notes of dates, the time, any witnesses, the specific incident details. So after you've had a discussion with that steward and or that worker, it's important that you document all that. As a principal, vice principal, although you're going to want to be accountable for everything that goes on in your school, it's important that you realize that the principal or vice principal do not own the grievance process. That is owned by the board, primarily the Labor Relations Department. Therefore, a principal or vice principal cannot simply decide to take a grievance. This is something we often hear, and we often hear that from new leaders that have joined the organization that don't understand the scope of the grievance process and the fact that it is actually a legal process. A grievance resulting in arbitration is actually a documented legal decision that an arbitrator renders and is retained and can be researched by anyone. So it is a legally binding process, and as such, the board owns the grievance process. As a leader, you will start to deal with many circumstances of conflict, of question. People will often question your decision-making, why you have done things, why you haven't done things. When a grievance is filed and those discussions commence with the Labor Relations Department, the Labor Relations Department will ask you many questions, and they will look at the matter in a very in-depth process, primarily through the eyes of an arbitrator. The reason for that is at any point, a grievance could proceed to arbitration. So earlier we talked about the importance of acting in good faith and not arbitrarily making a decision simply because we have the management right to. Arbitrators will look at that, as will the Labor Relations Department when they're speaking to you and obtaining the background information related to grievances. Some of the items that an arbitrator will look for, which are consistent with the items that the Labor Relations Department will take into consideration and will discuss with you, is the length of service of the employee. Did the employee commit an offense in their first year of employment, or are they a 26-year employee with an excellent work record, inclusive of excellent performance appraisals, and this is their first error? If it is, we may enforce discipline that is less harsh than that of a first-year employee who has already been coached once or twice on the same matter. The Labor Relations Department will also look at the seriousness of the offense in terms of violating the board rules of conduct or board obligation. When we're looking at that, we're also assessing whether or not the employee clearly understood the rule or the policy that they were violating. Have we consistently applied and enforced this rule or policy across the school? For example, as a leader, consistency is very important. So if your A player, best teacher, attends school 5 minutes before the start of the instructional day, but they're a fantastic teacher, and they are often the teacher that's volunteering, they're running extracurricular, etc. And then we have another employee who may be having some challenges, and they're our more difficult employee, and they're attending 10 minutes before the start of the instructional day, and they're out the door first opportunity. They don't volunteer for anything. They don't provide any assistance over what is required by legislation in their role. And as the administrator, you raise concern with the employee who is not your A player, attending 10 minutes before the start of the instructional day, but you don't raise concern with the A player, great employee who's attending 5 minutes before the start of the instructional day, when both parties are required to be present 15 minutes before the start of the instructional day. The Labor Relations Department is likely not going to support the administrator in disciplining the staff member who attended 10 minutes prior to the start, because we have not been consistent and fair with all of our employees. Essentially, as a leader, you are acting in an arbitrary manner because you're choosing to apply a policy inconsistently across your staff members, simply because one member is an A player and another is a C player. Those are items that an arbitrator will look for. They are also the items that the bargaining unit will raise at an arbitration. They will provide evidence if we have been inconsistent, keeping in mind again that it is their obligation under the Labor Relations Act, under their duty of fair representation, to ensure that we as leaders are being consistent and fair and equitable with the enforcement of rules for all staff. So again, we're going to ensure that the employee knew they were violating the rule or policy and that it could lead to discipline. Is this a policy that has been communicated? Or is it simply a policy that resides somewhere on the board website that no one has ever paid any attention to or discussed with staff, but suddenly we're applying these expectations and expecting employees to understand that a violation would result in discipline? One of the most important items is whether or not the employee admits to the misconduct and they apologize for their behavior. An arbitrator will absolutely look to determine whether or not an employee acknowledged their error, are sincere, and their intention is to correct their behavior. At the end of the day, with performance management, our goal is always to correct behavior. It isn't to penalize someone. It isn't to destroy someone's career. As a leader, your obligation is to always try to correct behavior so that our staff can be as successful as possible. It is not about penalizing. It's about correcting and supporting people in growing in their profession. Our unions. Our unions have a legitimate role, and they have a legal responsibility to represent their members. That means our unions have a legal obligation to hold us as leaders accountable for equity in the application of our expectations, to ensure that we are treating all staff with respect, that we are upholding the collective agreement, we are complying with the collective agreement. So when a union leader reaches out to you as a future principal or vice president and reminds you of an obligation within the collective agreement, they aren't simply power tripping. They aren't trying to make your life difficult. They are, in fact, ensuring that they are meeting their legal obligations within the Labor Relations Act and their duty of fair representation. As a leader, it's important that you know the collective agreements that exist in your school. As principal, vice principals, you've come from a teaching environment. So of course you're going to be familiar with the teaching collective agreements. However, as a principal or vice principal, it's important to realize that on any given day, at any given time, you will have a minimum of 4 to 6 collective agreements applicable in your school. You'll have your collective agreement that applies to your teachers, possibly another collective agreement for your occasional teachers. You'll have the collective agreement representing your custodians and your maintenance staff, potentially another collective agreement that represents your educational assistants or your early childhood educators or your child youth counselors or your office coordinators. On any given day, it's important to know that 4 to 6 minimum different collective agreements apply. While you are not obliged to know them all inside out, you are expected to know which collective agreements apply in your workplace and where to find them and to read them so that you can adhere to the expectations of those collective agreements for the employees that are provided those provisions. As a leader, although we're primarily talking about collective agreements, it's important that you realize there are many other policies and legislations that apply in your workplace. Board policies, procedures, handbooks govern what we do. Our collective bargaining agreements. But it's important that you realize all of the different pieces of legislation that also apply in the workplace. So the Education Act and the regulations. Often the expectations within the Ed Act will not be located in the collective agreement. For example, arriving 15 minutes before the start of the instructional day will not be found within a collective agreement, but it will be found within the Education Act. The Employment Standards Act. The Employment Standards Act of Ontario sets out the minimum employment legislation in the province. Often collective agreements have historically provided what's referred to as a greater right of benefit than the ESA. So in unionized workplaces, often there was never a requirement to familiarize yourself with the Employment Standards Act as much. However, that has recently changed. For example, the Employment Standards Act explicitly indicates that if an employee has been employed with the employer for greater than 5 years, they are entitled to 6% vacation pay if they are in a position that is represented by the Employment Standards Act. Where that may not be consistent with the collective bargaining agreement is that a collective bargaining agreement may simply refer to 4% vacation. Because until 2017, Vacation, at a minimum under the Employment Standards Act, was 4%. Never had it been contemplated that vacation would be increased to 6% in 3 years or 3 weeks after 5 years of employment. But that changed in 2017, according to the Employment Standards Act, and many collective agreements would not necessarily provide that benefit. Therefore, the Employment Standards Act provides a greater right of benefit. And although we're governed by the collective agreements, we must also comply with the Employment Standards Act. The Ontario Labour Relations Act and the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act. The Workplace Safety and Insurance Act governs all of the processes related to injuries or illnesses that occur in the workplace as a result of a work-related function. The Ontario Human Rights Code, very important to familiarize yourself with the code as it's referred to, because the Ontario Human Rights Code have obligations that an employer and a union are obliged to comply with. Those requirements, primarily under the duty to accommodate, can often result in trumping local collective agreement language. For example, there may be a circumstance in which a worker with a permanent impairment requires accommodation, and the position that they're capable of performing based on their permanent accommodation is one that is currently posted and ought to be provided to a more senior employee according to the collective bargaining agreement and the job posting article within that collective agreement. However, if that is the only position within the bargaining unit for which the employee is capable of performing, then the employer, being the school board, and the union, and the employees that are represented by that union, have an obligation within the Ontario Human Rights Code, duty to accommodate, to provide that position to that employee, thereby trumping the job posting protocol within the collective agreement. So although the collective agreements primarily govern how we act and what we do within the education sector, as a leader, you must familiarize yourself with all of the other pieces of legislation that apply. Within our collective agreements, there will be minimal reference to health and safety. What applies primarily is the legislation found under the Occupational Health and Safety Act and related regulations. As a leader, that is probably one of the most challenging circumstances you're going to find yourself in as you're struggling to get through your day and all of the different challenges and obligations, and suddenly there's a knock at the door and the Ministry of Labor is present. Everything ceases and you respond to that Ministry of Labor inspector, and that inspector will not be referring to the collective agreement during their inspection. What they will be referring to is the Occupational Health and Safety Act, known as the Green Book. And I'm sure at some point in your PQP program, you will spend some time on occupational health and safety and your specific school boards as you move into leadership roles. Will spend a great deal of time familiarizing you with the obligations as leaders within the Act to ensure that both the workplace and our employees are kept safe and compliant. So it's important that you realize, while you're obliged to know the collective agreements in your workplace, you also have to stay cognizant of the fact that there are at least 6 other daunting pieces of legislation that govern our workplace, and you have to be aware of those. And as leaders, we have to comply with those. We often joke about, for all of our future leaders, not confusing the title with the role. In human resources, we often say that the principal, vice principal role is equal to an HR manager, assistant HR manager. Because on any given day, at any workplace, as that specific leader, you are responsible for complying with 5 out of the 7 core HR functions. So that includes progressive discipline, team building, coaching, complying with the collective agreement, the early safe return to work process, and the duty to accommodate, having that Ministry of Labor inspector pop in to your office, ensuring that you're selecting the right candidates, recruiting all of your available positions, and there will be a lot of them, training and developing and coaching, all of your new teachers, your new EAs, your custodians, wage and salary administration. That's primarily a corporate function. So you aren't responsible for that function. And pension and benefits are also a function of the board. But when you look at this list, you can see how important the role of a principal vice principal is, and just how much of your time is spent on HR people type issues. Then we talk about our principal performance appraisal, because as wonderful as all of our leaders are, it's important that there's a structured process in place to provide that feedback to ensure that our principals and our vice principals are progressing through their careers and growing as leaders, and that there's an appropriate framework to ensure. So how does the PPA support the goals of the Ontario Leadership Strategy? Well, the PPA is a key component of the leadership strategy, and it supports 2 goals. Obviously, to attract people to the role and to attract the right people, aspiring leaders, and ensure that they're supported and that there's a structured process in place for principals and vice principals. Our organizations are only as good as our leaders. So it's important that the Ontario Leadership Strategy is supported by attracting the right people to the role. We want to develop the best possible instructional leaders. And in order to build the capacity, it's really critical that the PPA process focuses on professional development and growth. Just as leaders, we expect you to support the staff in your school and help them on their leadership journey and on their professional journey and being the best teachers, EAs, custodians, office coordinators, etc., that they can be. It's important that as a school board, we focus on your development and growth, and that's done through the performance plan and the annual growth plan. So how should principals and vice principals be using the Ontario Leadership Framework? As you develop your annual growth plan and your performance plan, you should be referring to the Ontario Leadership Framework. The summative report requires the principal, if they're appraising a vice principal, or the superintendent of education to review the practices and the competencies in the framework and select a few that have contributed strongly to that principal or that vice principal's success in achieving the goals, and identifying some that may require further growth and improvement. It's important to note that as areas are identified for further growth and improvement, that's not a negative, that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for you to enhance your performance in your role and to grow within your profession. There is only one mandatory form within the PPA Technical Requirement Manual, and that's the summative report form. And this form must be used in accordance with the Ontario Regulation 23410, which is the Annual Growth Plan and Performance Plan. So let's do a quick overview of the principal-vice principal appraisal process. So similar to the TPA, there's an initial meeting between the appraiser, i.e. the principal and or superintendent of education, and the appraisee to develop the performance plan and the annual growth plan. Again, linking that back to the Ontario Leadership Framework. Then there's a second meeting between the parties to discuss the progress, where someone's progressing well and what areas they need to focus on, and perhaps what supports could be put in place to ensure the success of the appraisee. Then there's a third meeting between the parties, again, to review the results of the performance plan and the annual growth plan. That often results in a satisfactory rating and the process is complete. Sometimes, though, it may be that there's an unsatisfactory rating. What that means is that an improvement plan is required to be developed by the appraiser, and a meeting is required, and the steps of the performance appraisal are repeated, as you've already gone through. Then there's a second appraisal, and that occurs between 40 and 80 school days. Again, optimally, that results in a satisfactory rating, and the process is complete. However, sometimes there is still further development needed, and the person has to spend some more time focusing on the areas of concern, and an unsatisfactory rating is identified. At this point, similar to the TPA process, the individual is placed on review status, and the improvement plan is updated. And again, a meeting is required with the parties to review the updated improvement plan. And at this point, the expectations are fairly explicitly identified and what is required in order for the appraisee to be successful. Again, the same steps as the very beginning portion of the performance appraisal are repeated. So in a meeting, a second meeting, and then the third appraisal rating, which occurs between 20 and 60 school days. The optimal result is a satisfactory rating, and the process is completed. In the event that that is not the result, and it's an unsatisfactory rating, at that point, the board will review the progress, and the board will make a determination on next steps related to the PPA process and that specific appraisee. And that may result in removal from the position. They're excellent resources. As future leaders, I would suggest you definitely familiarize yourselves with the PPA Technical Requirements Manual, which is fairly daunting manual. However, the ministry has also prepared an amazing PPA FAQ document. It's 13 pages. It provides fantastic summary materials specifically related to the timelines, the Ontario Leadership Framework, the expectation on appraisees, and also identifies periods in which someone may be absent or seconded, how that affects the PPA process. And a link has been provided for your reference, which will allow you to link to both the PPA Technical Requirements Manual and the FAQ document. I want to thank you for providing me the opportunity to spend some time with you today and walk you through these 3 areas. And I wish you all the best on your growth and your movement into leadership roles. And I look forward to the opportunity to work with some of you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us today, Deirdre.